Hello, welcome to part 2 of making mead like a Viking. In the first part I showed you how we cooked this batch of mead over a small fire, mostly for the smoke because we want a smoky flavor. You don't always have to heat your meads up, they'll ferment perfectly fine. Actually, room temperature is ideal, and boiling, some recipes call for boiling it and skimming all the must off, or the scum off that comes up as you're boiling it. That isn't necessary, and it actually kills off a lot of the wild yeast and a lot of the good flavors that will give it character. So it's up to you, that's fine. All I really did with this was heat it up enough that it almost came to a boil, took it off, let it sit for a couple of days to fully cool down. And now what I'm going to do is transfer it to an open mouth vessel. The reason you want an open mouth vessel is because what we're doing here is letting it spontaneously ferment. Sometimes I will add yeast from a homebrew store, or some backslop, which is actually a little bit of actively fermenting mead from a previous batch. There are different ways of getting the fermentation going, but what we're doing here is what the Vikings would have had access to, or any other ancient culture, which is just the yeast that are coming through the air, the yeast that have gathered on this stirring stick, which is called a totem stick or a magic stick in a lot of ancient cultures. If you read literature in ancient brewing, it's a very common term to come across. The stick was often passed down through generations. It was almost considered magical because of all the yeast that gathered on it with each batch. So a lot of the yeast you're going to get is from the stick. You don't have to do that. You can use a nice, clean, sterile stirring stick if you prefer. But all I do was clean this, and I don't actually ever sanitize it. And that goes against a lot of modern home brewing. But the Vikings didn't have homebrew stores, they didn't have chemical sanitizers, so that's what we're doing here. If you want to do it the modern way, that's fine, I do that as well, but that's not what this video is about. You want the big open mouth, so you can allow lots of air and yeast to come in, because spontaneous fermentation in particular requires a lot of aeration. So not only will you need a lot of air to come in, but you'll stir it quite a bit as it's fermenting to keep the air bubbles going and the yeast active and happy. So without further ado, I'm going to take the must that I prepared over the fire with honey water and also honeycomb, pour it carefully into my fermentation vessel. This also provides lots of aeration as well. So that will help get the fermentation going, just transferring it to another vessel. And the next step is to take an infusion of the woody hops, or gesho, that I use for this. It's an herb from Ethiopia that they use for tej, which is essentially a spontaneously fermented mead. You can also use oak bark. Oak is very common as a tannin, even in modern recipes. You can make an oak bark tea. Boil it, wait for it to cool down a little bit, put the leaves or bark in, whatever you're doing. Let it sit for a little bit and turn into a tea. If you have a little sip of it, it actually does make a nice tea as well. So, and this will also add a bit more wild yeast. And just for good measure, I always add a handful of organic raisins, other than the obvious health reasons. The main reason to go for organic is it hasn't been sprayed or nothing else has been done to it to kill off all of the wild yeast that have gathered on it, and that's what we want here. We want all of the good wild yeast to enter into this magical brew. And the Vikings and a lot of other ancient cultures would incorporate dances, song, meditation. Some cultures would want to wake up the fermentation spirits and they'd do loud, crazy dances. Others would try to coax them in. You can do whatever you want. I like to listen to a lot of folk metal or folk music, Viking metal. Sometimes I do a little dance, but not usually. Sometimes you can kind of hang out with your mead and caress it and talk to it, but I don't know that you really need to do that. I don't do it either, but you can if you want. But essentially, what you're trying to do here is bring in the brew spirits, the bridgie man. May not be pronouncing that right, but it's an ancient term. Or they believed that they were bringing in some spirit, and if they called in the spirits properly, then a couple days it would start bubbling. And that means that you called in good spirits. And then at that point, it's really important to pay close attention to it and treat it well to make sure that you get the good spirits in and not the bad spirits. Take your magic stick, totem stick, stir vigorously. You'll probably want to do this for about 5 minutes. Get a vortex going. Go the other direction. Stir. And you will want to do this several times, at least a few times a day for the next week early. Ideally, in ideal temperature, about 70 degrees is a good medium. You'll get fermentation in 2 or 3 days. Sometimes it can take up to a week, especially if it's your first time. You can use vessels like this, which have a nice spigot for testing and bottling it. This is also a nice one to use. This is an old winemaking crock that my dad used, and I prefer to use it. So that is essentially it. I'll see if any of the honeycomb or any of the other stuff is still floating around here. Most of the honeycomb is broken up, so when I do go ahead and switch this to another vessel, I'll be skimming a lot of this off and straining it out. But for now, I'm going to leave it all in there because it will help with flavoring and with additional yeast. In about a week is when you're going to want to determine whether or not you want to drink it as a young mead. It'll be sweet, it'll only be mildly alcoholic, but it'll be quite tasty. Or maybe drink a little bit, transfer the rest to an anaerobic environment, no air. This is when the one modern home brewing piece of equipment that's good to use. You'll rack it to this, which means transfer, and you can leave it. If you want to bottle it, you'll want to probably leave it for at least a few months to make sure all the carbonation, all the lees and everything else is drifted down to the bottom. And if you bottle too soon in a normal wine or a beer bottle, you might have explosions because honey is a sugar and it builds up a lot of carbonation. But if you give it enough time, that carbonation will just slowly turn into alcohol. So that is the essence of it. I'll go into more detail on racking, aging, and bottling in another video. We use a cheesecloth to cover this up. Some people say to use. You can use a clean dish towel, even an old shirt. You might want to wash it first, but the yeast will have no problem dropping through this. Especially if it's summer, put out some. I do honey, maybe a little borax or not, and cornmeal. And that ants are coming after your mead. They'll come to that first. Take it all back to their ant hills, and the cornmeal expands in their stomach, and bye-bye ants. So you do need to protect your meat at all costs. This also is important to keep all the way on. You might want to tie it on. Keeps fruit flies from coming in, or house flies and coming in and laying eggs. That's the only main important thing about this, is to keep those out. The fruit flies do help bring on acetobacteria, which will essentially turn into vinegar. but we're going to avoid that. Also, if you leave it out for too long, it will turn into vinegar, more than a week or two. That is not a problem as long as you, once it's started actively fermenting, then you can go ahead and switch it to the carboy, cut off all outside air contact, and you're good. I have a book coming out with Chelsea Green Publishers in about fall of 2015, and those should give you a lot more detail, but I'll have more video coming up in the future. So in the meantime, Skål!